talk will be recorded. Thank you, Yanju. So if you don't want your face appearing in that recording, you should turn off your camera. Stop sharing your video. The talk will be available later through the Center for Korean Research YouTube channel. And please note that chat is enabled only for you to correspond with the hosts. And that's how we'll be doing the Q&A after Albert Park finishes his presentation. So let me tell you about our speaker today. So Albert Park is the Bank of America Associate Professor of Pacific Basin Studies at Claremont McKenna College in Southern California. He is an historian of modern Korea and East Asia. He's a native of Chicago, did his BA at Northwestern, took an interlude in New York City at Columbia, and then came back to Chicago to do his PhD in modern Korean history at the University of Chicago under Bruce Cummings. In his in the first phase of his career, he wrote a lot about religion, the history of religion in Korea. His first book was on was titled "Building a Heaven on Earth: Religion, Activism, and Protest in Japanese-Occupied Korea." And he also has co-edited a volume called "Encountering Modernity: Christianity and East Asia." He's also been putting in yeoman service at the Association for Asian Studies. I think he just stepped down as a member of the NEAC committee last year, and he also serves as associate editor for the Journal of Asian Studies. So if he was working on Christianity, he has now gone fully in a different direction, and he's now working primarily on the history of the environment and environmentalism in Korea. And he is the co-founder of a really interesting project called EnviroLab Asia, which is funded by the Luce Foundation, which researches environmental issues in Asia. And he's also working, has founded and co-edits a new series from Cornell University Press on environments of East Asia. So Albert, it's really good to have you speaking at UBC again. We usually go for 45, 50 minutes, and then we have till about 6:15 for Q&A. So the floor is yours, and thank you very much. So please join me in welcoming Albert Park.
Thank you. Thanks, Ross, for inviting me and for welcoming me back to UBC. I was there 3-4 years ago, and as I was mentioning to Don and Ross, I just have fond memories of UBC. It's just beautiful, and more importantly, just interacting with wonderful and just super sharp faculty up there, and the graduate students really made a big impression on me. So I'm very happy to be back, at least through Zoom. I hope one day to physically go up there again. But I'm just gonna go through my talk, have a time for Q&A. I'm gonna be mostly reading off of presentations, so you'll see my eyes sometimes going down. I do have a PowerPoint that I'll share as well. Ross, if you feel like you can't hear me or something's going on, just interrupt me and let me know. We always know there's going to be Zoom issues, so I'm happy to take a step back and just try to figure out the technicalities. So let me share the screen first. Okay. And then I'm going to, let's start from beginning. Okay. So, agriculture destroys the environment. Destruction is defined as the action or process of causing so much damage to something that it no longer exists or cannot be repaired to its original state. And the history of agriculture has shown that agricultural production tore up environments to the point where the present human and non-human conditions no longer reflects or embodies the past. Destroying landscapes through agriculture has given way to all sorts of environmental concerns. The exhaustion of soil fertility through intensive farming and chemical fertilizers, chemical runoffs that pollute water, livestock produce methane that contributes to greenhouse warming and climate change, the poisoning of human and non-human bodies through chemical pesticides, and the annihilation of complex ecologies. Environmental alteration that gave way to agricultural destruction in modern Korea first took off on a model farm in Seoul in 1884, supported by King Kojong. It was like any farm in Korea at the time. Seeds from the US were planted. Its landscape of fertile crops looked like the landscape of farms in the US Midwest. And it featured livestock and farming technology from the West. Most importantly, the government asked Westerners to oversee operations and teach American and British techniques of farming. The 1884 practice farm marked the beginning of a new era of agriculture, a break from past customs, conventions, and norms. Instead of sustaining a moral economy, agriculture and the environment should be employed for the creation of national wealth and becoming modern, Korea becoming modern. This simple but decisive act symbolized and materialized agriculture as a destroyer of continuity for a future of national prosperity. Under the changing political economy, nature, or the non-human, assumed an instrumental value and role for national development that endures today. Despite its transformative effect in the modern era, agriculture has been omitted from the environmental history of Korea. A few factors explain this. First, the environmental history of Korea has been a slowly developing field. Catastrophes and disasters have propelled the study of environment in Japanese and Chinese studies. The modern history of Korea lacks any large-scale explosive events of environmental disaster that has urgently stirred scholars to study the relationship between the human and non-human. Maybe one exception would maybe the 1990s major floods in North Korea is considered an environmental catastrophe, but even that is very much understudied. We simply don't study environmental issues that are less apparent, less visible. Second, strong research biases in Korean studies toward the urban has given way to scholars locating the origins of environmental issues and environmentalism starting in the 1960s, the beginning era of rapid industrialization and urbanization, and thus overlooking the long history of environmental change and alterations that started in agriculture. Third, people today generally avoid viewing agriculture as a destructive process. As a source of our food, it's commonly framed as a therapeutic, regenerative, and non-destructive process. Overlooking agriculture's impact on the Korean landscape ignores the damaging consequences of the industrialization of agriculture on the environment. Today, I'd like to introduce a story about the environment in Korea. It's a story that deviates from the standard narratives of the environmental history of Korea. It's told in four stages: a stage of replication, a stage of power, a stage of possibilities, and a stage of permanence, and especially in South Korean agriculture. Each stage of the story will provide a brief overview of events, developments, and thoughts, and collectively produce a different historical narrative about the environment in Korea. Studying each stage positions us to reflect on how to identify and measure environmental destruction in ways that pays close attention to varying scales of change and the overall human imprint on the non-human world. It forces us to meditate on the meaning of destruction and how to identify and measure environmental destruction. This new historical narrative then presents an opportunity to think about how to draw up mechanisms of awareness that take into account varying degrees on the interaction between human and non-humans and the outcome of those interactions on the worlds of humans and non-humans. This talk is based on my research, current research on the origins of environmental thought and movements in modern Korea. During Q&A, I'll be more than happy to address anything more in depth. So, the first stage. Among the strands of diverse systems of knowledge circulating in the late 19th century, civilization and enlightenment discourse and the Tonghak religion furnished new language on how to approach and treat the non-human world in the modern world. Based on its monistic philosophy, Tongak held an ecological worldview that emphasized a mutual coexistence between humans and non-humans under which both are equally valued. The civilization and enlightenment movement drew up an ecological order that gave more weight to the division between the humans and non-humans. Becoming modern and prosperous required mastery over the non-human world. Civilization and enlightenment authorized humans as the dominant central force of history as who should transcend nature. The realities of human and non-human exchange in pre-modern Korea, of course, featured interactions in which people were far from compassionate and respectful toward nature. But the longtime view upheld by the chosen state still valued balance and harmony between humans and nature. The ecological views of the civilization and alignment camp, however, became codified in official statecraft through the chosen state's approach to agriculture. Up until the late 19th century, cultivation through technological innovations increased yields, and surpluses were sold at markets. Signs of a capitalist agricultural system emerged. Still, the majority of agricultural cultivators engaged in subsistence farming through the use of traditional methods, such as polycropping and applying organic fertilizers. These cultivators forged landscapes that were, quote, carefully integrated, functionally mosaics that retained much of the wisdom of nature. They were based on close observation and imitation of the natural order, close quote. Influenced by civilization and enlightenment thought, the chosen state sought to take hold of the changes in agriculture and further accelerate its pace of transformation. It pursued the commercialization of agriculture through industrialization for the purposes of modernizing the country and increasing the wealth of the nation in the face of imperial threats. Erecting a model farm stood at the center of these reforms to industrialize Korean agriculture. The concept of the model farm originated from the modern period. It served as a place of agricultural experimentation to advance farming knowledge and practices. In this capacity, it became a site to figure out how to increase production, especially for the market. Following his trip to the United States with Korean government officials to learn about Western institutions and practices, Choi Kyung-suk established a model farm in Seoul in 1884. Assisted by George Folk, who was an American official at the time, and given land by King Kojong, Choi envisioned the model farm as a site of agricultural testing and research, a place that would raise the same crops and employ the knowledge, techniques, tools that he personally witnessed on farms in Massachusetts, New York, and California. Naturally then, Choi named it the American farm. Choi planted a variety of seeds that were supplied by the US Department of Agriculture and helped breed and raise native and foreign livestock and horses. The farm featured the latest farming tools from the West, including 18 different types of farming machines, including the latest plows used in the United States. Though appearing to be simple in nature, the model farm was a significant biological, technological, economic, and political agent. First, it introduced non-native species directly from the West throughout Korea. Jersey cows, Shetland ponies, pigs, sheep, bulls from California were all raised on this farm. The first crops produced from the seeds coming from the US were allowed to go seed. Those seeds were then distributed to 305 local areas with directions on how to plant and raise those crops. Second, it promoted and spread the mechanization of farming based on Western methods. Third, the model farm framework introduced a method of farming that relies on outside knowledge and resources to experiment, replicate results, and increase production. It encouraged a scientific approach to farming that would lead to techniques and discoveries that would apply to other areas of the country. to produce results similar to what was achieved on the model farm. This approach called for uniform production or monocropping. Fourth, the model farm introduced a method of farming that called for top-down government supervision, the centralization of development. Control would be exercised through uniform measures and scales, that is, measuring the productivity of a farm through standard numbers. Close surveillance was necessary so the state could ensure continual production of agriculture for the wealth and prosperity of the nation. Late 19th century agricultural reforms stood out from earlier state-led endeavors because farming and land acquired new value as commodities for national prosperity. Outside norms, instead of domestic traditions of farming, served as the guiding lights on how to move lands from a rude to a more refined state and become thoroughly controlled, productive environments. The norms would underlie a process that would give way to a less biodiverse environment that was more productive, like those found in the United States. The irony of carrying out an American-style agricultural revolution was that critics in the US at the time had heavily criticized prevailing farming practices because they exhausted soil fertility and ruined lands. Yet despite these criticisms, the path to salvation rested in the American dream of altering the environment for productive purposes and replicating model farms throughout the peninsula. Second stage. The Japanese colonial state in 1910 inherited and significantly intensified and scaled up this process of environmental alteration through agricultural replication for market production. The urgency behind speeding up and expanding this process came from the dire need for inexpensive sources of food to cheaply feed the rapidly growing urban population in Japan. Sufficiently feeding a population moved Japan to organize a capitalist agricultural system that would be controlled by the colonial state's political economy, and it would unleash a wave of changes to the environment. This process of alteration or change through agriculture drew its energy from a push for monoculture farming. Planting and harvesting rice became a priority in colonial Korea. It required the colonial state to prioritize its production overall. The colonial state organized large-scale top-down agricultural drives to advance the mission of widespread rice cultivation. These drives featured the distribution of high-yielding rice seeds modified in Japan. Experimentation on rice seeds occurred under the watchful eyes of scientists at the Agricultural Experiment Station and the Agriculture and Forestry School in Suwon. Inheriting the features of the American model farm, these two institutions combine to form a complex of colonial knowledge, production, and learning. Scientists at the station produced surveys of the non-human world. They cataloged native and non-native species, carried out agricultural experiments to boost production, did research on chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and shared its finding with the colonial government that used them to create agricultural policies. The school was an elite institution to train Koreans and Japanese to be future leaders in modern. The complex was pivotal in not only producing new knowledge, but also making sure that this new knowledge was disseminated. By 1920, improved rice varieties accounted for 62% of total rice output. Most original Korean rice varieties disappeared as the dramatically changing landscape was filled with rice paddies to feed the mouths of the hungry, urbanizing Japanese. The success required a potent partner, chemical fertilizers. Korea had a low soil fertility with low pH and organic matter content. and low levels of phosphorus, potassium, and nitrogen is true. Low soil fertility agricultural production fulfilled domestic needs as agricultural cultivators employed organic fertilizers in the form of animal manure, green manure, and quote unquote night soil. It only became an issue now because of the need to rapidly increase agricultural output for export. The colonial state relied upon Japanese entrepreneurs to supply a great amount of chemical fertilizers in a short amount of time. Large-scale production of fertilizer in Korea was carried out by corporations like the Japanese Nitrogen Corporation, or the Chizo Corporation, which was founded by Noguchi Shitagawa. It invested nearly 62.5 million yen in the construction of Chosun Chizo Hiryo, basically the Korean Nitrogen Fertilizer Corporation in Hungnam. The production of ammonium-based fertilizer, which included nitrogen, allowed for steady supply fertilizer for Korea and Japan. Chizo's fertilizer plant in Hungnam used the Casale procedure to produce ammonium fertilizer, not the Haber-Bosch. This procedure combined nitrogen and hydrogen through high pressure process in large steel barrels. The Casale Corporation gave exclusive rights to use this procedure to the Chizo Corporation in 1921, and the Chizo Corporation then transferred this technology to Hungnam in the late 1920s. This method of producing ammonium required an abundant amount of energy, electricity essentially, that led the company to produce 3 hydroelectric plants in the northern part of Korea. Alongside electricity, the fertilizer plants operated by Chizo in Korea required massive amounts of resources, such as coal, coke, and carbide, which led to the establishment of other factories and mining projects owned by Chizo. So the Chizo site was huge. This is a map of the Chizo Corporation, and if you could look at my pointer here, this is where the fertilizer is being produced, but it's not only fertilizer plants. There was a munitions plant here later in the 1930s, housing for employees, Japanese and Koreans, right? All different types of chemicals were being produced in this complex over here. And I'd be happy if you're interested to share this map. This is a fabulous map of the area. This is a photograph of Hungnam, which is right next to the water. Right? It produced a variety of products in addition to nitrogen-based fertilizer, right? Like carbide, aluminum, magnesium, gunpowder explosives in the 30s, pig iron, zinc refinery, mining, various other metals. It had other factories in Yeongnan, Cheongsu. It was producing rubber, heavy oil refinery, and methanol. Collectively, Chizo created what I would say is a fertilizer industrial complex, where resources were drawn from the land to a central location for the production of fertilizers and chemicals. With the center, this complex linked together non-human, such as water, and human entities to establish an instrumental landscape for exchange, production, and consumption. The fertilizer industrial complex introduced environmental changes on 2 levels. First, it altered multiple landscapes, disrupting the biodiversity of soil with nearly 600,000 tons of chemical fertilizers being applied on farms by 1937, and coal and mining excavations throughout the peninsula, specifically in the northern part. Second, it disrupted land and water to create a new space of pollution, a never encountered space where Koreans were wondering, why were things dying? So they're dumping all the chemical waste into the water, the Hungnam plant, so the fish are dying. So people are, what's going on? The water's turning green and brown. And questions of what is happening. The third, the fertilizer industrial complex also introduced a new regime of human pain. Factory workers in Chizo plants encountered the raw state of nitrogen fertilizer, white powder, and new experiences of chemical-induced pain. There, their skin stung with pain. They had watery eyes. Their chests were burning. Their bodies were turning yellow, and they found that they couldn't wash off what they would say is the white powder. Lee Puk-myung captured the feelings and emotions of the factory workers and the deterioration of their bodies through his book, Chilso Biryo Kongjang, based on his experiences at the Hungnam factory. One of the protagonists in the book declared, quote, "The environment is eating away my chest," close quote. One must remember that there were no industrial laws protecting these workers, unlike industrial laws protecting some factory workers from environmental issues in Japan. Non-humans and humans, such as soil and the bodies of factory workers, found themselves undergoing a gradual process of destruction. It was a process of monocultural replication authorized and led by a watchful and commanding colonial state. An elaborate capitalist political economy lie behind this process as it tied together disparate entities and elements to forge a new space of power. In so doing, it forged environmental conditions where the human and non-humans were treated in unprecedented and in damaging ways. There. Korean soil is dead, according to American officials after 1945. Up until 1943, the colonial state pumped chemical fertilizers into the soil. By 1943, however, usage of chemical fertilizer drastically declined as chemical fertilizer plants were turned into munition plants and chemical fertilizers were exported mostly to Japan. Soil in Korea rapidly declined without the steady input of nitrogen fertilizer. Occupying the southern part of the peninsula, American forces scrambled to procure supplies of chemical fertilizers in a short amount of time, especially without the Japanese-created agricultural system in order to feed a very hungry population. The 1948 energy crisis compounded the challenges of not only finding new sources of fertilizers, but also starting the agricultural economy. And we have to remember the crisis is all of the fertilizer plants are in the north, right? And the energy, electricity is produced in the north. The periods between 1948 and 53 feature the tragedies of the division of Korea and the Civil War. Wars, however, are ruptures that unsettle norms and pre-existing norms and create opportunities for reimagining and creating new conditions. Early on in the war, it became a period where energy flows were reimagined. That is, the way energy should be produced and consumed. The United Nations Korean Reconstruction Agency focused on fertilizer and pesticide production to meet domestic food needs. Leaders of the UNKRA, mostly American officials, turned to E. Pfeiffer, a German scientist who was working in the US. Following the principles of Rudolf Steiner, Pfeiffer had worked in Switzerland. Through his philosophy of anthroposophy, Steiner developed biodynamics, who believed that a farm was an integrated, whole, living system made up of interdependent, harmonious elements. This is, quote, what he would say, a living organism. Alongside advocating organic farming practices, he also spoke about the need to align those practices to astrological and cosmological processes in order for harmony in the universe. Steiner is also very famous for founding the Waldorf schools that are found throughout the world. E. Pfeiffer turned Steiner's ideas into concrete practices. He in particular invented a composting system to turn waste into fertile fertilizer that would be just as powerful as popular chemical fertilizers, but not as dangerous to the organic matter of soil. A mixture of bacteria to accelerate the composting process was a main part of the system. After reading about how Pfeiffer started a composting system in Oakland, the UNKRA invited him to Korea to discuss the possibility of creating a nationwide composting system. The UNKRA officials thought the system would decrease Korea's dependence on imported fertilizer. Though the project never took off because Pfeiffer, he was ultimately unable to come to Korea, the serious consideration of Pfeiffer's system represented a pivotal moment of possibilities for shifting ecological conditions and promoting biodiversity through healthy soil. More than just having environmental value, it could have socially produced an alternative to the conventional system of energy production and flow that required the organization of vast inputs, including human labor and natural resources, through an infrastructure of control and coercion. The fourth and final stage. The failure to implement Pfeiffer's composting system led to calls for producing chemical fertilizers and pesticides domestically. Dr. Pedro Abelarde, an economics affairs office for the United Nations Korean Mission, argued, quote, that climatic conditions, terrain, and population density in the country necessitated an intensified system of agricultural production that would require both irrigation and heavy utilization of natural and commercial fertilizer, especially to restore the rapidly progressing erosion of the soil. Under Park Chung-hee's developmental plan, agricultural fertilizer and pesticides combined to become the cornerstone of the new industrial chemical complex for South Korea's fast-paced development. And this began an assault against the soil. The plants produced enough fertilizer to become a net exporter of nitrogen fertilizer by the 1960s. He created a number of fertilizer plants, 5 or 6 at the time. The state pushed chemical fertilizers and pesticides onto Korean farmers. It supplied these chemicals through an elaborate government-organized infrastructure, 농협. Founded in 1961, 농협, the National Agricultural Cooperative Federation,
such and such a part of came in and they killed everybody.
Became the sole distributor of chemical fertilizers and chemical pesticides. It represented the interests of the state, not the interests of the farmers. It is not a cooperative in my point of view, and I can talk about that later. It supplied services for modern agricultural sector, marketing, agro input supply, so it supplied fertilizer machinery, credit, and other banking service. In order to obtain capital and valuable resources, farmers were forced to join the cooperative. Its vast network of local offices and cooperatives guaranteed the state's ability to reach farms throughout the country and become forms of surveillance for ensuring that farmers carried out state agricultural plans to boost chemical, fertilizer, and pesticide use, especially for rice production. The drive to intensify rice production through chemical fertilizers and pesticides dramatically increased through the New Village movement, or the NVM, or the Saemar Undong, as in Korea, to modernize the rural area in 1971. The NVM grew out of 2 concerns. One, finding new food sources to replace the lost amount of aid, food aid, coming from the phasing out of US agricultural aid programs. And 2, to alleviate discontent by rural inhabitants over the growing income inequality between the urban and rural. The NVM's approach to modernizing the rural included infrastructure projects, agricultural initiatives that distributed new types of fertilizer and strains of seeds, including the new high-yielding seed Pongil, and classes to teach villagers on how to improve their lives. Throughout the movement, farmers were inundated with daily messages of producing rice with chemical fertilizers and pesticides for protecting and strengthening the nation. The intense pressure to employ chemicals for farming gave way to multiple changes and developments in the ecosystem. On the non-human side, there was a couple changes. The organic content of soil, or the SOM, decreased steadily since the colonial period and even more after in the 60s and 70s, moving from 4.4% in the 1920s to 1.8% by the middle of the 1980s. 3 to 6% organic matter is the ideal percentage for soil organic matter. And of course, I can explain more what soil organic matter is during Q&A. Toxins in the air and waterways from industrial factories was the second thing that damaged the environment. And you saw particularly toxins in the air, pollution from the air, destroying agricultural fields around Ulsan and Onsan in the southern part of Korea. The human impact. There is many human impacts to this type of chemical farming. From soil, there was the sickness from pesticide poisoning, such as you see here, Cohen-Suck's mercury poisoning in 1978. There was a rise in cancer among farmers by the 1980s through the use of various types of organic pesticides, as you see here. The most important one, of course, I'm sure everyone knows, is DDT. The third human impact is persecution from the government and neighbors for being alternative. If you were an organic farmer at that time, people would call you a communist. And Paek Yeon-jae at ANU is writing this fabulous thesis on organic farming. And he talks about that, about how people will call them communists for just wanting to do organic farming. What happened was the corrosive destruction of soil and the human body, or the non-human and human over time. Since the colonial period, components of capitalist agriculture, monocultural cultivation, the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides in agricultural developments that I had not covered today, such as livestock farming, combined to produce capitalist agro ecosystems. These agro ecosystems stood out from anything before. Capitalist agro-ecosystems were constantly, quote, a movement toward the radical simplification of the natural ecological order in the number of species found in the area and the intricacies of their interconnections, close quote. All of these gradual reforms constantly required reforming, policing, and disciplining individuals and social bodies. The intersection between soil and chemical fertilizers and pesticides point to a larger theme, the systemization of human and non-humans. This systemization refers to the multifaceted process of incorporating non-human elements, nature, and the overall environment and people into the state's centralized agricultural system for food and resource production. It has been a process that in the end has led to control and domination of humans and non-humans in the everyday. So, how does locating the origins of modern Korean environmental problems in agriculture and the rural help us to think of a way to trace and narrate Korea's environmental history? Unlike modern Japanese and Chinese history, where there were these catastrophes that punctuated historical time and ruptured non-human and human landscapes, Koreans' environmental issues originated through acts, practices, and interactions in the mundane, everyday of organisms, especially humans. The application of chemical fertilizers and pesticides on farmlands and reactions by non-human entities, the handling of toxic chemicals in factories and the birth of new biological processes, the extraction of coal from dusty mines, realigning the flow of water through hydroelectric plants, and polluting waters with chemicals and the biological transformations of sea life. In this capacity, these simple ways of being and doing occurred within the everyday ecology of organisms, the relationship of living things to each other. At the moment of happening, actions and interactions by humans and non-humans hardly dislocated or shattered their everyday ecology in a loud, pronounced way. They were simply a layer in the diverse fabric of living. The paradigm of everyday ecology scrutinizes the routines and daily actions of humans, their moments of being, their interactions with the non-human to form a social totality, and how these interactions are conditioned by forms of power. From this paradigm, it becomes possible to detect and trace changes within a particular context, and how the particular context and the changes within it are commonly connected to and conditioned by a wider milieu of biological, economic, social, cultural, and political processes. Indeed, each context is made up of moments in everyday life. Moments are fleeting. To sustain what's occurring or happening in that moment commonly requires an exogenous force. The intervention of the exogenous force solidifies the connection between the biological and social. The particular context, in other words, is a window for understanding a wider socio-ecological totality and its connections to it. Everyday ecology, in particular, is a platform for rethinking how we detect and assess destruction and its overall scale. It demonstrates that destruction is not necessarily just a visibly violent and immediate event or phenomena. More often than not, environmental destruction and its consequences on the human body and nature, such as soil, appear to be innocuous and happen more discreetly over time with a particular context. In the end, everyday ecology goes beyond the sudden rupture. It expands the temporal and spatial dimensions of narrating the environmental history of modern Korea to make it more inclusive. In conclusion, the current historiography in environment Korea demands an inclusive approach. Current and past governments of South Korea have forged a history that declares there was never any colossal environmental issues. In fact, according to government-produced historical narratives, the state under Park Chung-hee inspired a new environmental consciousness and environmental movement through the Chaeyeon Boho Undong, the movement to protect nature, starting in the late 1970s. Because of Park and this movement, the state, according to the narratives, has always been environmentally conscious and a supporter of quote unquote green growth. I'm going to stop share here in the concluding paragraph, sorry. As this presentation has shown, this narrative whitewashes Park's industrial policies that destroyed soil and farmlands, polluted the air, and led to the ecological collapse of wetlands. The narratives claim that Park and the presidents that followed him have taken environmental issues seriously and have protected humans and non-humans because of government-led environmental movements. And there hasn't been any large environmental disasters. However, evidence shows that the government since 1960s has been poisoning the environment and people's bodies through conventional agriculture and urban industrialization. The movement was not an environmental movement, but a regime of power that blamed individuals for pollution, not the government and companies. It is everyone's problem. It spreads the blame where the blame should be placed on the state and chaebols. Narratives give meaning and value and therefore inform and guide our lives. Alternative narratives about the environment through the paradigm of everyday ecology are therefore a necessary means for uncovering undisputed historical claims about sustainability and fundamentally rethinking and refashioning our approach to the human and non-human relationship. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, excellent timing and very interesting talk. Can we, so first of all, everybody out there, you can submit your questions through chat, and those should be visible to both Albert, me, and Yeonju. And so there's already a question from Christina Yee who had to duck out. Can you see that, Albert?
Let me see.
In theory, if you open the chat, you can see it. Otherwise, if you'd rather, I can read them. It's up to you.
Is it, I wonder why organic farmers in South Korea are called communists?
It's actually right above that.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Ask you if you could tell us more about the archives you utilize and methodological strategies you employ to answer these difficult interdisciplinary questions you are asking about the history of agriculture in modern Korea. Sure. So what was my the archives?
Yeah.
Essentially, a lot of government records, particularly 농협, which is you can use and very easily accessible. Um, Also government magazines like the Semel Undong magazine, which you can find very easily. So there's a lot of government literature. And another group that I'm studying is the 4-H Club in Korea, and they have a multiple of books, which was a semi-government organization. So that's one set to understand like to kind of see the environmental issues, especially kind of condition enforced by the government. Some other archives that I used, of course, were just newspapers. I mean, if you look at the 1920s and 30s, if you look at 조선일보 and 통일보, they have so many newspaper essays talking about environmental issues. Now, of course, they don't frame it as environmental issues, but they're saying, what's with our air is changing, our water is changing. So they don't have the language to articulate what's going on, but from our contemporary perspective, we know what they're talking about, especially if you connect their comments or questions to where they are, particularly in the northern part of Korea, where there's a lot of industrial development. Methodological, I think the one thing that I have learned a great deal, especially through EnviroLab Asia, this initiative here is a cross-disciplinary initiative where humanities, social scientists, and scientists work together to study environmental issues. And one thing I've learned a great deal is learning a great deal from scientists. I think that is where I've learned so much. And my dearest colleagues today are scientists. And they have told me and explained to me to look at changes in a different way, biological, chemical, right? And then what I can do with my historical framework is connect that to political, social, economic changes to provide a holistic view about changes and transformation to the human and non-human. So there's a lot of scientific, I think, information and methodologies that I've incorporated. I think it also, STS, Science Technology Studies, is also key, something that I'm learning more and more. And I think, works, the typical works like Bruno Latour, Donna Haraway, all these figures have just been mind-blowing to me because they've really just opened the way that I can start looking at the environment in a different way. And they force us to look at the environment and the human world in a holistic manner. So I would say those are some of the methodological approaches I've taken or have adopted.
Okay, actually, that I've had a request to for me to read the questions. So let's try this. There's quite a few coming in, Albert. So there's another question. This person asks why. I wonder why organic farmers in South Korea were called communists. Did North Korean farmers adopt organic farming systems? And can you expand on this idea of organic farmers being perceived as somehow communists?
Sure, that's a great question. So to answer the second part first, no, North Korea was not engaged in organic farming in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. In fact, you can argue they were far more advanced in South Korea in industrialized chemical farming. Because think about, first of all, right, what North Korea did very well is to electrify and industrialize the rural sector very quick in the agricultural sector, right? Giving them a lot of inputs, electricity, gasoline, right? All the things that would fuel the machinery that you use to produce all these crops and harvest all these crops. Then you had Hungnam and you had all these other chemical plants that produce all these chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And I didn't really focus on pesticides, but that is a totally different area. And I would say far more destructive than chemical fertilizers. But they had all those plants in the north. So if you think about it, that combined with the machinery, the electricity, with the chemical fertilizers and pesticides, and also with the outlook of the North Koreans about advancing their economy in a rapid pace to create this new industrial base for all, then it makes total sense. And it had a very industrial chemical based farming. And I would suggest, if you're interested, just you can find these North Korean literatures on farming in North Korea in the 60s and 70s. And I use it for my class all the time. And it's these great, like, colorful pamphlets that show you about the joys and wonders of North Korean industrialized farming. So it's not because of North Korea that people are calling necessarily, the South Korean organic farmers are not modeling themselves after North Koreans. The reason that they're called communists is because in the 1970s, so many people are engaged in the NVM, the New Village Movement, Semar Undong, and are I think buying into this discourse that increasing rice at all costs through using chemical pesticides and fertilizer was for national development. You had to do this for the sake of the nation. So if you're then a farmer saying, I don't want to use chemical stuff, it's starting to kill me, it's starting to bother me. And I believe in these ecological viewpoints about harmony between the human and non-human. Then you start seeing people, and this is something I cover in the second section of my book, when we look at Pulmu Hakyo. We look at Han Salim in the 80s. We also look at all these other agricultural groups who are organic farmers, right? And people look at them and say, they're really strange. They're not doing what the government's telling them to do. So because they're doing something alternative and it's going against the plans of the government, then they're automatically labeled communists, right? Even though they're not communists, they have no communist bones in them. They might have leftist ideas, but they're not communists. So I think you have to look at the context in which they're developing and growing and doing things. It was a very hard time to be alternative in the 70s and 80s.
Okay, let's see. So this question is framed around the idea that you've got a generation that grew up in Korea in the 60s and 70s who are now sort of appreciating just, sort of the price that was paid for economic growth. So the question is, has there been enough of a generational shift in the powers that be to openly criticize what happened in terms of this environmental and social impact? And would there be any possibility of reparations for those farmers that suffered from things like chemical poisoning?
Yeah, so a lot has changed, of course. I mean, one could argue it's because of the 80s, 90s democratization. There's a couple things happening, right? The first thing you have to say is by the 90s and the early 2000s, the state is basically giving up on agriculture. And it's kind of a long story, but if you've heard, I mean, the reason that South Korea has all this wealth of like grapes and kiwi is because they have all these free trade agreements with other countries that supply cheap agricultural foods. And what ended up happening is the countries that they trade with, they said, to like Colombia or to Chile, you have to give our chaebols some, you have to lower import taxes. In return, we'll give you our agricultural market in South Korea. So free trade agreements really has destroyed the agricultural sector in South Korea because the state has de-emphasized agriculture. It's not a food sovereign country anymore. It relies on a lot of imports, with the exception of rice, of course. Mm. So you have that changing in the 80s and 90s. You also have democratization where people are speaking out more, of course, critical of the government. And then also in that space, you have these agricultural groups, Han Salim in particular, and then Pulmu Hakyo, which is different from Pulmu Corporation. And you have all these other groups, Indaramang, which is a Buddhist group. So you have all these groups starting to speak out about the damages of chemical farming on the environment, right? And because they have that space to do it in the 90s and early 2000s and so forth. So there's a lot more talk about organic farming, but it's not the most popular thing, meaning standard conventional farming is still standard. Organic farming is tremendously hard. Natural farming, which is a form of organic farming, is even harder. So you don't have that many people engaged with it. You have a lot of young people trying it out, but then they usually move back to the city to, resume their urban lifestyle. So reparations, I don't think that would have, because no one necessarily sees the farmers as victims, even though they were victims, in the sense of cancer rates, their skins being burned. They suffered tremendously during the 80s and in 90s. And I think this is the issue. The issue is, in some ways, we don't frame their issues as environmental problems because we don't see agriculture as an environmental issue. You have to connect those two. And that's the problem. Everyone sees like agriculture as this beautiful thing, which it is because it produces food. But on the other hand, it is so destructive to the environment, the body, certain types of agriculture. And I think it's a responsibility of historians and people in Korean studies to reframe how we look in the environment so that there will be justice to like the farmers and to all those people who suffered because of chemical farming.
Okay, the next question, I'm going to amplify a little bit. UBC has a very, shall we say, well-respected faculty of forestry. And we've actually had a couple Koreans come through and go on to do interesting research. One was a professor here, Jean Namgung. I don't know if you've heard of his work, but so for example, so Jean Namgung, and then who was a professor here and then passed away some years ago. And then a gentleman by the name of Tak Kwang Il, who worked on the reforestation of South Korea. So the question is, are you aware of anything about, Namgung's work was about how basically the Japanese destroyed Korea's unusual forest diversity because of a preference for a specific kind of tree. And the follow-up I would have to that is, when you say that Korea didn't have any sort of major environmental catastrophes punctuating its ecological history, wouldn't you count the Korean War as a major ecological catastrophe? Because that pretty much deforested most of Korea, didn't it?
I would, and I agree, and I think that's that's the thing about. I agree with you. 100%. Like I think that the Korean War is definitely a rupture in terms of how it destroyed the environment. It's particularly through the bombing campaigns and so forth. So I actually don't disagree with you there. But because of the way we study the Korean War, it's so human-centered, right? Of course, because there was multiple millions of deaths, right? And it's such a tragedy. So the human has become the chief person in the story, and the environment has kind of been left out. Which is ironic, because the environment should be there because it was just pummeled, right? And it was re-altered and so forth. And I'm starting to see, I think there are more people, like we did do, like in Journal of Asian Studies a couple of years ago, I helped edited a form with scholars who looked at the impact of war on the environment. It was called War and the Environment on the Korean Peninsula. We have an essay on the Korean War and the environment. So I think more scholars are looking at that. So that's a good thing. The first part of your question, this question is perfect for my colleague at UC Irvine, David Fedman. If David just came out with a recent book about forestry practices during the colonial period that you should get. And in it, he outlines the whole history. It's a comprehensive history about Japanese policies in the colonial period, and particularly looking at, the Japanese. David does a really good job of showing the tension, because the Japanese weren't all about destroying the forest or tearing down the trees. In fact, there was afforestation campaigns under the Japanese, right? So I think what David does in his book in such a wonderful way is saying, look, everyone focuses on the 60s and 70s, Park Chung-hee's afforestation campaigns, when in fact you have to look under the colonial period. Now, I think in David's book is he complicates that whole story, and he doesn't put it in a light where saying, wow, what a great thing the Japanese did. He looks at the power dynamics of how they accomplished that, right? And so you do have afforestation campaigns, but it comes at a cost, a social, economic, political cost to Koreans, right? So I would, whoever asked that question, I would strongly suggest you to look at David Fedman's new book for sure, to get a comprehensive history about forestry practices in the colonial period and a little bit post 1945.
And how do you spell his last name?
Fedman. David Fedman. He's at the UC Irvine. He's in the history department.
Got it.
Ross, you should invite him. He's a very good scholar.
Great. Thanks for the recommendation. Another question. Could you say a bit more about the backgrounds of both Choi Kyung-suk and Noguchi Shitagao?
Yeah, Choi Kyung-suk was I don't know that much about him other than he accompanied the party that went to the United States in the 1880s to check out the political systems and check out how America became such a powerful country, right? Looking at the legislation, the visiting dignitaries, and so forth. The interesting thing about Che, he was a Chosun official, is that he was just interested in agriculture. So when they went to DC, after they went to DC, then they went up to Massachusetts and New York to visit farms. He was really fascinated by that. And then what ended up happening is he went to California, bought a bunch of horses, bunch of animals, went to the Department of Agriculture, asked for a bunch of seeds. So he was, I would say, a Chosun official who really hoped that agriculture would modernize Korea. And if you look at the 1880s and 1990s, Choi Kyung-suk ideas about modernizing agriculture for the nation is something that I think Ko Jung shared. I think a lot of officials shared because it makes sense, because what resources did Korea had at that time? They had agriculture, and a pretty bountiful agriculture. So, and if you look and they looked at history, each country in the West started through agriculture. I mean, capitalism starts through agriculture. It doesn't start through industrial urban development. So, yes, Noguchi, the founder of Chizo Corporation, fascinating figure. This Japanese entrepreneur who founded all these chemical fertilizers in Japan, comes to Korea, and he really makes an empire in Korea. And there's a lot of, I would say in Korean already, a lot of great biographies on him that talks about how he creates this empire of fertilizer, hydroelectric plants, chemical plants, mining plants. And he ends up just staying in Korea and dying in Korea. And I think he endows his wealth to some type of foundation in the 40s, but I think it's used for mobilization purposes. I'm not quite sure, because he dies during the war. But he's just a fascinating Japanese entrepreneur that looks at Korea as, I would say, as the frontier. He's the Japanese that looks at Korea as the frontier, and he's very successful in Korea.
Another question. Thank you for the great talk. This person says, I'm interested in your saying that you get insights from Bruno Latour and even Donna Haraway. Could you explain more how you embrace their perspectives for looking at non-humans and humans in your work on agriculture, and what sources might be good just for the human side?
So yeah, so I've become more familiar with science technology studies, STS, under Bruno Latour and Donna Haraway's ideas. Now, what I take from Donna Haraway, what I've read from her is this idea of breaking down boundaries. I mean, that's what I think. I think Latour and Haraway share this idea of breaking down disciplinary boundaries that have often contributed to our dichotomous way of thinking about the human and non-human, as thinking them as separate. That's from my interpretation of them. And so that for someone like me who has been so looking at, I'm interested in political economy and culture, the relationship, but through the human context, kind of seeing that is kind of revolutionary because it's telling me that my methodological approaches were insufficient and very limited. And it's telling me that if you really want to understand change, if you really want to understand alterations, if you want to understand how humans have changed, you have to incorporate the non-human. And that's where, I mean, from what I've taken away from Harvey, especially about just the breakdown of disciplinary boundaries and everything between the human and non-human. The sciences working with the social sciences and humanities to provide a comprehensive view about the entire environment, which includes the human and non-human. Bruno Latour, of course, STS studies, about how science is very much influenced and conditioned by social structures, right? So it's not as objective as we think about it. And I think it becomes very handy, especially the chapter I'm working on, looking at the Suwon Agricultural Experimentation Station, or the School of Forestry that was created in 1906. Didn't speak much on that two institutions, that complex, but they were so powerful colonial institutions. They very much were, these scientists were doing these objective works, but very much were conditioned by the environment of colonialism. I mean, colonial officials coming down from Seoul to Suwon to visit and saying, look, what can we do to produce more rice? Well, they would say, okay, you have to do this, but it's not, when they're giving these answers about how to raise things biologically and chemically, they're also telling how to mobilize people to change their behavior. Because in order to produce more, you just can't throw seeds, right? Humans have to be involved. So scientists are also thinking about how to reorganize human behavior, right? And it's all conditioned by, I think, the milieu, the colonial milieu that is telling them, look, we have to produce because we have an objective here, and that is to produce for Japan, produce more rice, export. So I would say those are, I'm coming into STS, Donna Haraway, more and more, and I'm really liking it because it's just expanding my way of looking at the world.
A quick follow-up question to question about, I guess, Noguchi. Did the Chiso Corporation survive World War II?
So that's a good question. I actually have a document by the US military in Japan that answered, and I haven't looked at it thoroughly. So to be honest, I can't tell you if it does. I mean, Noguchi dies, of course. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What am I saying? Of course it survives. I'm sorry. I was just immediately thinking of the 1940s. Of course it survives, because Chiso Corporation, I'm sure many of your people in the audience are very familiar what happens in Minamata, Japan. Minamata, Japan was the mercury poisoning. So Minamata disease is mercury poisoning. And it's named after a town in Japan where a corporation dumped all this mercury into the waters. And the fish ate the fish were living in the water. They were eating other fish. And then who eats the fish? Other people, and particularly expecting mothers. So what ended up happening is because of intense mercury poisoning, you have the mass deformities of children, of babies, of deaths, right? Well, who's that corporation? It's the Chiso Corporation.
Oh.
So I'm sorry, I'm sorry. It's I can only explain. It's been a long day, but
yeah.
That's some fact I should never forget. But the Chiso Corporation is connected. There's that lineage, right, between the colonial and the post-colonial. And the one thing I want to say, and it's not my argument, is you have to look at that connection, right? A lot of scholars are looking between post-colonial and colonial to understand Chiso. It just doesn't happen in the 50s and 60s, what Chiso doing. One could say they're modeling their behavior from what they were doing in Hungnam, right?
Okay.
And you have to think in Hungnam, there's nothing protecting the people then, nothing. So yes, Chizo Corporation does survive.
All right. Well, we're at 7:15. There's one last very short question from Don Baker. Is the delicious pear, the pear that we eat from South Korea, a product of human intervention in Korea's agriculture?
Well, everything, yeah, that's a good question, Don. I mean, it is delicious pear, right? And it is, of course, I mean, all agriculture is human intervention, right? And, right, because if, I don't know if you ever gone to the farm, but like when the pear is grown, at one point, each pear has to be individually wrapped with foil because they're worried about, and this is if you're an organic farmer, because you're worried about pests, right? Now imagine how much human labor goes into wrapping every foil. That's why pear is so expensive. Organic pear is so expensive in Korea, right? So that's a lot of human labor. Agriculture involves a lot of human labor. Organic agriculture involves a lot more human labor, right? And you'll pay for it in Korea and in other parts of the world. But yes, of course, human intervention. But I think if we're to kind of think about it carefully, there's different forms of intervention in agriculture, degrees of intervention, right? There could be the chemical intervention, which is very powerful, or the organic intervention that tries to work with the existing environment to produce these type of agricultural goods that are not harmful to humans and non-humans.
Sorry, one last question, and then
Sure.
then we'll let you go. Just came in. So could you say something about the relationship between the growth of some of the chaebol and their entry into the chemicalization and industrialization of agriculture, especially fertilization?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm actually going to start working on that chapter soon. I don't know that to answer that, I don't know the direct connections. I can only suspect there are direct connections because, so I've already looked at 1950s documents and already under Sing and Reed, there's quite a number of chemical factories producing chemical fertilizer after 53, but more pesticides. And I don't know exactly what type of pesticides, but they're producing pesticides. Now, one could only imagine that those companies extend into the 60s and then possibly could have been incorporated or digested by like the larger chaebols, particularly by like LG, which is a big chemical company, right? I mean, all these chaebols are huge chemical companies. We just know them for cars and other things, but they're huge chemical companies. So I would imagine that there is a connection, but to be honest, I can't tell you if there's a direct connection because I just don't have that historical knowledge yet.
Well, it sounds like it's a big book you're working on, so we'll have to wait for these various chapters to come together.
Yeah.
So thank you. You've had a very long day. It was very interesting. Thank you, everybody, for coming and for your questions. And please join me again in thanking Professor Park.
Thank you so much for having